Mindset Podcast. We're your guide as you make your way through life, getting better 1% every day. We believe that life is lived and true victory won through adversity. Nothing easy is ever worth it. We believe in the warrior ethos and support those that choose to walk that path.
Hello and welcome to the Warrior Mindset Podcast. Man, I really appreciate you tuning into this show as opposed to the other, 10 million other podcasts and YouTube videos you could be watching. That means a lot. Thank you for spending your time here. Hopefully you get something out of this. I want to talk about burnout today. And let me pull this up. There's 3 articles I found related to this, and I thought they were worth going through because they had some really interesting conceptual parts. So this first one was from Y Combinator, which if you're not familiar, well, first off, I've had the good fortune to be self-employed in the internet realm of doing work for, in fact, September will be 20 years that my business has been in effect, and I've been doing it before then. So 25, 28 years working on the internet, seen a lot of businesses, websites, web apps. This is pre-iPhone. I've seen it all come and go. That doesn't mean I'm like an expert on everything, but I've been around a little bit. And Y Combinator is an investment. They invest in startups. They've been around for a while, and they have a pretty good track record. But they have this blog, message board. I don't know what you call it anymore, but it's called Hacker News, Y Combinator. Really good stuff. This is about burnout in the software industry, and I find it, anytime. Well, let me just start here. So, I teach karate. I'm a 3rd-degree black belt, and karate's been around a long time. It has sort of made its life, right? It started out that karate was mostly adults training, and over the past 20 years or so, now it's mostly kids that train it. I don't teach kids, I teach adults, but that's kind of where it is, where it started out 100% adults, 90% adults, and over the past 20 years now it's the other way. It's maybe like 10-15% adults and the rest are kids. Jiu-jitsu is another thing I train, and it's funny to watch that. It's not quite as old commercially in the United States as, say, karate or any other type of Japanese martial art. They're sort of I'm watching them, and as an industry, it's sort of going through some things, and it's like I see things online posting about it, and it seems like that world is discovering things for the first time that other things have long since discovered and worked their way through. It's the same thing in almost every industry. Software development's no different. People have been doing work in offices for a long time. Software development is relatively new compared to lots of other types of jobs in offices. And, they think they've discovered it for the first time. So all that is a caveat, that the fact that I'm pulling this from a software developer, a Hacker News website, put that little grain of salt in there with it. But anyway, we're talking about burnout, and this question: is it me, or do most software jobs cause burnout? And it's really not so much that question. Is the very first answer I thought was very eloquently explained. And let's first. So I took some notes here. Let's first define burnout, okay? Burnout, and I really liked how this guy or girl, let's see, who is it? Saber Tall, whatever that is, defined it. Burnout stems from a disparity between invested effort, and achieved outcomes. Think about that. Invested effort and outcome, right? So if you're spending all of your time working on something and you're not really getting anything out of it personally, communally, financially, spiritually, mentally, whatever, after a while, you're going to feel that burnout, right? That's kind of everything, I think, and the idea that it's just software developers, I think, is a little special. I mean, a lot that's pretty much anything you do if you are putting in an inordinate amount of effort and you're not getting anything back out of that effort, you're eventually going to burn out on it. Most people quit doing the thing. And that disconnect leads to reduced willingness to put in more effort, right? We have a lot of things came out of the COVID shutdown, a term called quiet quitting we hear about, where people are, just doing the minimum, what's minimally expected of the job that they hold. And, they have deemed that quiet quitting. And, I think it's largely a symptom that a lot of people have felt burnt out in that sense that they're, you know, they don't feel like they're being valued, right? They're not getting anything out of it that makes them feel valued, or they're not feeling that value in the effort they're putting in, right? And above and beyond what they're minimally being paid to do. That's, my definition of the quiet quitting. I think it's a symptom of burnout, honestly. And yes, it is a big thing in software development, working on the internet, doing anything on the internet. You can make 1,000 posts and get responses, and most of them are probably going to be negative. You have to overcome that. One of the things that they talked about in this post about software development is that, people who work on things, physical things, often gives you a visible, touchable, tangible result, right? Building a house, the house gets finished, you can go in it and live in it. Building a piece of software, you might not ever actually use it. So in some fields, this intangible nature of the work is challenging for the brain to feel that sense of accomplishment, that sense of completion. So if you're working in the software industry, I think you need to find a way to get to something like that, and whatever that might be. Maybe, I don't know. I can't offer really any suggestions that aren't going to sound stupid, but I think that's probably where we need to be. Rapid changes in iteration, right? So quick iteration causes shifts in requirements for you. So if you've been working for a week really hard on something, and then some other dude that you don't even know changes the direction of the software, and then everything you just did is useless, like like you didn't need to do it, now it's different, that's going to cause a level of frustration and, not be very tangible in terms of applying your work to those results, right? That's going to cause a level of burnout, probably, if that happens too often. So, if you're a leader, project manager, or, managing software developers or whatever, you got to be aware of that. That's not just in the software world. I think that applies everywhere. You've got to make sure that, people who you are paying or who work for you or under you, whatever effort they're putting in there, you've got to value that effort. Value the effort, not necessarily the outcome, maybe. All right. And then arbitrary deadlines. This is the thing that I've recently been kind of spinning on. So many deadlines lack clear rationale and are arbitrarily set, right? The absence of understanding behind deadlines adds to those feelings of burnout. So those are the two things that came out of that dude's or that user's post. So this is something I struggle with, like in my own projects, where it seems like we create a realm of stress around something. And like the deadline was something the team made up, right? And often we make up the deadlines and we impose it on the client. The client may have just one big deadline that's, 6 months to a year from now, and you make all these little ones. And then, it's like do or die time around these things. And, while it's important to have those set of goals, AKA deadlines to meet, to know that the project's going along, At the same time, that can cause a lot of stress around meeting those things, particularly if you have someone managing you or working on the team that is really kind of deadline driven mentally. That can cause a lot of stress in the team, can cause a lot of burnout if you're always fighting this uphill battle of having to work to these deadlines. And I know things like sprints, you know, in the software world, there's a concept called sprints. You work in these little blocks of um, to dos. They can cause some stress too, especially if the person who makes those doesn't really have a full understanding of the work, the nuts and bolts of the work involved to getting those things done, and if they don't necessarily apply to the overall project. Again, that's not just software development. That's anything. It's building a house. And then also, if your team or you, if you're in a team, doesn't understand the rationale behind why certain deadlines exist or the importance of certain deadlines, that's going to cause some feelings of burnout, because it's kind of like, have you ever gotten an email from a manager or whatever, and everything is like there's 5 things and everything is important. Like you've got to do all 5 things. Like you can't do them all at once. Or someone who writes in all caps and bold, right? If everything is emphasized, then nothing is emphasized, right? You can, like, if it's a do or die deadline, you can only have one. You can't have 10, right? Because you only work on one thing at a time. Trying to push your team or being pushed to work on multiple things at one time, it's not good for you. You know, you can communicate up the chain as well about that stuff. That's a different podcast, I think. Okay. Unforeseen changes. Unforeseen circumstances can render your efforts unnecessary, right? You could be spending time on something, spend a few days on something to realize, man, we didn't think about this thing, or the client changed this thing, or the client's client changed this thing, and now everything I just did is worthless. Questioning the value of expended effort when results could have been achieved with less strain. That's another one where, you don't have, maybe the deadlines are stacked on top of you to the point where you don't have time to think about the way you want to work or to plan the way you want to work. You're just continually hammering against these deadlines, and you're kind of doing it with brute strength. If you do that too long, that's gonna pay off in a bad way, right? With as far as burnout's concerned, because you can't just brute strength your way through everything. It's just not healthy. You have to have time to plan, to make sure you're working smarter, not harder. Let's see. Mitigation and solutions, okay? Enhanced understanding for managers and leaders can alleviate burnout. Yeah, if you are a manager, if you're managing a team, you've taken on the role of managing that team. So therefore, you have to own that. Which the second one I'll talk about, effective communication about contributions and outcomes plays a vital role. So there's 2 prongs to that. One is that you have to own the things. And I've worked for a lot of people before where they don't necessarily own. When I say ownership, I mean it in the sense of like Jocko's ownership, like podcasts and talks that he does. You can't simultaneously be in charge and not responsible for the outcomes, right? They go together. And what I mean by that is I've had people say to me before, like, I've literally been pulled off of a project before, to only then 3 months later, the project's a failure, to then be called in to ask why the things I did 3 months prior were done that way because they think that it made the project not successful. That's a really weird one where you're sitting there like, I haven't even worked on this thing for 3 months. Like, what are you talking about? So you can't be in charge and be, the big baller on the project and then not actually take responsibility for the outcomes of your decisions and the project. So you have to understand those things. You got to know what you're talking about as well. Like if you're managing people, you got to know what those people do. You got to know why they're doing it, and you got to know what you've asked them and why you're asking them. You can get that through communication back and forth, but you have to know those things. Effective communication about contributions and outcomes. You have to communicate stuff to your team, like when it's due, why it's that way. Okay. And then you have to let them know what ownership that they need to take. You have to communicate those things. If they don't know that they're fully responsible, and then you hold them fully responsible, but you're going around telling everyone you're responsible, who's responsible, right? It doesn't, you need that clarity, right? And I'm talking about these things in relation to the subject of burnout. You're going to burn out your team working that way. And I'm not trying to just describe like the worst project manager ever. These are all things you could do subconsciously. Okay. These are all things you can do without even knowing that you're doing this to your team. So, other mitigation things, offering small accomplishments after setbacks helps maintain motivation. It's your responsibility to keep the ball moving forward. Okay. As a manager, or someone trying to make sure your team or the people that work for you, your employees, whatever, aren't getting burned out. If there's a setback, right? If there's a problem or a big issue or whatever, specifically building on little successes really helps. That helps in general. I think part of your project plan for whatever it is, you should probably be looking at those things and how you can have little steps that build to make the overall thing come in more focus or become more clear or become closer to completion or whatever. You can build that into your project plan. Reducing arbitrary deadlines and ensuring achievable goals without excessive pressure. That's a lot in one statement, but that should actually be like your tagline, right? And I talked earlier about these deadlines, and that often there's like, one big deadline, right? If you're doing client work, like I do a lot of times, you get a new project and it's like, well, this thing is due like 9 months from now, 12 months from now, 8 months from now, whatever, 3 months from now. It doesn't matter. That's really the only deadline that like really matters in terms of, I guess, CYA, right? Making sure you get stuff done for your client so they give you more work in the future. And so what you do is you take that and you reverse engineer these little steps and you add deadlines to those things. Those are all real. Ultimately, they're just arbitrary, right? You just kind of made those up. So you have to remember that, right? And there's a balance between remembering that you just made those things up and holding people accountable so they get things done. But you can do that in a way that doesn't feel arbitrary. And you can do that in a way that you make sure that those steps or those goals are actually achievable, right? If any of those things require, interaction with that client, that's going to take more time than you think. It always does. You have to err on that side of planning, because I forget what law it is, but Fitz law or whatever it is, Murphy's law. But like, if it can happen, if it's bad and it can happen, it probably will. If you're planning, you need to plan for that. We had a whole podcast on being prepared and planning for contingencies and things like that. The same thing happens in projects. If you don't pay attention to those things, you're going to create stressful situations for your team, right? That might be one of the things you're living under in terms of stressful situations. It's just, I'm not going to say bad planning, because there's always unforeseen things, but it could just be, thoughtless planning. All right. And then you have to manage that pressure. Hopefully they're managing that pressure, right? You can't just be constantly hammering with deadlines and things. And also pay attention to your communications. Being careful not to be sort of passive aggressive with statements and things. Okay. It's super important. Like, I just got an email with something that I was already working on. I had been working on it, and this person, was working on some other things unrelated to the specific things I was working on. And they just said, like, I've been doing these things, blah, you know, you should have started on these ASAP. I hope you have, like, and that's just like immediately puts me in this reading that immediately puts me in a state of like, well, they don't understand what I'm doing. They're not paying attention to what I'm doing. They haven't valued what I've been doing for the past week because I've been working on it. right? You could have communicated that a number of different ways to where it doesn't sound sort of passive aggressive, right? That's a bummer. That's going to add to burnout. If you are continually being communicated to in that fashion, you're not going to enjoy it. You're not going to enjoy communication. In fact, you're going to probably avoid communication with that person. All right. So, combating burnout involves addressing the disparity between effort and outcomes, ensuring tangible recognition, and fostering that balanced work environment. Those are your responsibilities as a project manager or a manager. Okay. If you don't want burnout in your team. This other article that I found, When Work Didn't Follow You Home. This one's interesting. This is from this, who's this guy? Cal Newport, I guess, wrote this. And, he's talking about, back when he worked, I guess he's a Gen Xer. So this is, him working on things before, the internet being the way it is, before iPhones, before social media, right? It's very different. So he says here, I worked at a literary agency during the day. I got off work at 5 and I studied at night. The key was that this was just after the turn of the millennium. But what would you do when you had work emails? These coworkers asked. I didn't get work emails, I said. I barely had the internet in my apartment, right? So this guy worked his job as a writer and then went to school at night to get his master's degree, working full time, getting his master's degree. And he's telling his coworkers this in this new job that he has, who are much younger, who are like Gen Zers or whatever. And they were just shocked that he was able to do that. He was able to balance those two things. And that hit me. That was really fascinating in that. And I remember those days. It was kind of nice, right? Being able to go home and shut it off or go home and start something new. Now in my life, I try to foster that environment. I try to have blocks of time where I don't just focus on one thing. And I'm kind of lucky that way. I get it. I'm lucky. But I do 2 or 3 different businesses and I have to sort of compartmentalize those things. And then family, and I have to do that too. I mean, after all, are you really present at home if you're sitting on the couch with your computer out? You're probably not. Something to think about if you find yourself in there. So he did this in the early 2000s before smartphones and widespread internet. And the email thing, like I use the Google. I use Google, like Gmail, a branded Gmail or whatever. And there's a schedule. You can schedule when your emails go out. So if I write my email, unless it's like, I'm working on something that's an emergency, that's different. But I try to manage not having too many emergencies. And oftentimes a client emergency is not really an emergency. It's just that it's expectation or it's, it could be an expectation that you train the client to have. This is something to think about. So work emails, I've gotten emails from people that I've seen them that were sent at like 10 o'clock. We used to have a client that would email at like 1 in the morning and stuff like that. Now, anybody who's a normal human being doesn't expect you to respond to those things, right? There's a thing I have where I won't answer my phone. Like, I mean, if you're my wife or whatever, or someone that I know might need me or whatever, there's a few people in my favorites list. There's like 6 people. I'll answer the phone from, say, 12 noon until about 1 or 1:15 p.m. Now, if anyone calls you during the day, during that normal like lunchtime, do you think they're trying to reach you, or do you think they're trying to reach your voicemail? I know a lot of Gen Zers, they don't like phone calls, and I know I'm being sort of boomer-ish or old in my mentality here, so you can laugh at me, it's all good. But like, that's just my thinking. If they're trying to call me at that point, they're not really trying to reach me. They're trying to, call, and they could have just texted or emailed, but whatever. But they're calling. They're not really trying to reach me, so I don't even answer, because that's when people are normally at lunch. The same thing can be applied to like emails and texts and stuff like that. If someone's messaging you after hours from 6 p.m. until you know, 8 a.m. the next day or whatever, you're not obligated to respond unless you signed a contract that you would, but you're not obligated, right? You can make that thing wait. If I send a client an email, like in the normal constraints of a project, and it's about 2 o'clock, I schedule it for 8 a.m. the next morning. I just do. Probably think I'm weird, but what I've learned over the years is that if I respond to an email right away and I do that more than once, then I've told that person that I will respond right away. Then building that expectation that they have that they can reach me really quickly through this medium, right? And then later, if I take that away, then I'm ignoring them, right? Even though maybe I'm not, maybe I'm just literally driving my car across town, right? You are part of that process to train people. It's important. So that's my take on work communications, and you have to kind of balance that stuff. Um, lack of constant work communication led to a different perception of busyness and exhaustion for Gen Xers versus newer people in the workplace. The separation between work and home life made jobs feel less all-consuming and burdensome. That is something else that the older generation brings that the younger generation doesn't quite get, I think. Do you remember? I don't know how old you are listening to this right now. I'm 49. But do you remember a time when you identified yourself with what you do? So if somebody's like, "Hey, what's your name? Yeah, what do you do?" Like those are the two questions, right? I don't like those. I don't even like answering those anymore. I usually just tell them like something silly, like well, I build the internet, or I build things on the internet, or hey, I own a gym, or whatever. It's just something, whatever, to get past it and just get past that part of the conversation, because I don't identify with who I am authentically with the things I do 9 to 5, right? So having that separation is super important. You got to work on that. You got to cultivate that. That's a different podcast. We can talk about that too. But the other thing was like having an actually constrained work day, at 9 to 5 or whatever, can let you live in that area where you're at work, you're working, and when you go home, you're not working. And there are certain jobs that are like that. And sometimes I think, man, it'd be great to have a job like that. And it kind of would. But then other times, I'm lucky I don't have a job like that. I have a non-traditional job, so I have a little more freedom when it comes to time and other things that I can do. So yeah, so I'll link that up. It's a short one, really short one, but it's really interesting to think about those differences there. And then there's this last one that I want to talk about. It's not necessarily about burnout, but I think it can apply in the way you think about things. So, I preach this concept of Kaizen, of 1% better every day. And I do that because I know that trying to do something all at once will really burn you out. I've done that. I've tried to accomplish a lot really fast. What is the saying? A lot of people overestimate what they can do in a week, but significantly underestimate what they can do in a year, right? So just a little bit at a time goes a long way towards finishing something. What's the inverse of that? And that's why I found this article interesting, because excellence is a habit, but so is failure. There's another short article. I would really like to dig more into this with this person, but so making daily incremental improvements is often praised for leading to success and growth. I'm going to write Kaizen there. However, small, neglected, and missteps can accumulate and result in negative outcomes in the same way, in the inverse, right? So, how often have you had something go wrong and it's there staring you in the face and it's going wrong, and you realize it's because of 5 or 6 things that you didn't take care of? When that check engine light in your car comes on, you know, man, it's probably 4 or 5 things that you probably should have done on that preventative list. Same thing in health. Well, the same thing in business, same thing in relationships. So it's not just about thinking of the little 1% better every day. It's the little things that you have to do. You have to build those habits to make sure you're doing those things that make you avoid neglecting things or missteps or whatever. Okay. Addressing patterns of neglect early is crucial for preventing larger problems in the future. That one right there, addressing those patterns, like identifying them is probably the first biggest step, and then addressing those patterns that cause you to neglect things. Maybe it's your relationship, maybe it's your diet, maybe it's, you know, your car, whatever it is. Finding those things that you're not doing and make sure you spend 5 minutes doing it every day. Well, that's Kaizen too. That's 1% better. Not the inverse, which is just to ignore it, which we all do. I do. I'm not trying to stand on a soapbox. Personal reflection can reveal that significant problems often stem from numerous small, poor choices and neglect over time. Even if you just set aside 5 minutes to reflect on some of these things, I know that thinking about a thing is not doing a thing. Doing a thing is doing a thing. But you first have to identify it. You first have to think about it, right? That's important too. That's also Kaizen, as far as I'm concerned. And then the author gave some examples. Um, their drug addiction developed through prioritizing momentary pleasure over health and safety. Weight gain resulting from choosing immediate gratification over long-term health. I think that's every one of us. Relationship issues arose from avoiding difficult conversations and confronting mistakes. Yep, leaving things unsaid. I'm not talking about being a jerk and just pointing out everything someone's doing wrong, but the little things that if you know bother your partner, you need to address them. Otherwise, it's going to build up. I promise. Been married for 25 years. It will. Avoiding bad habits is equally important to cultivating good habits. 100%. So, to counteract these things, awareness of incremental neglect patterns is key, followed by deliberate steps to foster healthier habits. I'm not talking about a ton of work here. 5-10 minutes a day just to think about it, write it down. There you go. Just getting it out of your head into the universe, onto that paper, it's going to make a huge difference. All right, so wrapping up here. Effort, outcome, disparity fuels burnout. Intangible work heightens it. Swift changes, vague deadlines, unexpected shifts worsen the situations. Solutions are better management, recognition, and balance from those, or if you're in that management position. The earlier area of work, 2000s and before, lacked, the constant connectivity didn't exist, right? That's a nostalgic thing that we look back towards. Excellence thrives in incremental improvements. Neglect breeds failure. Those are some really great summary things to think about. Take that with you. I will make sure those are bulleted so you can copy and paste them and go work on that stuff. So that's all I have for you today. Talking about burnout makes me feel a little bit better. I'm going to go spend about 5-10 minutes thinking about things that I'm neglecting on a day-to-day basis in work, physical fitness and health, and then my relationships with people. Those 3 things. I'm going to spend 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going to write some things down, and then I'm going to think about how I might just move the needle just a little bit. I don't have to do all the work at once, but just a little bit, because doing just a little bit every day is going to pay bigger dividends down the road, as opposed to just continuously not doing anything. Okay. Even in the first project related things we're talking about with burnout, I'm going to think about those things too. So you go do that too. And then, if you want, send them to me, put them in the comments, whatever you want, we can talk about them. So until next time, get after it.